There is a number that researchers, aerospace engineers, and survival physiologists have quietly agreed upon for decades. Not a distance, not a temperature, not a pressure reading. A number measured in seconds. 180 seconds, 3 minutes. That is the window. The outer edge of human survivability in the vacuum of space without a pressure suit. 3 minutes, give or take, before the cascade of physiological events that begins the moment you cross the threshold of an airlock without protection becomes irreversible. Before the damage done to the human body by one of the most hostile environments in the known universe tips from survivable to fatal. Not 3 hours, not 3 days, 3 minutes. And in those 3 minutes, more happens to the human body than most people could imagine in a lifetime of thinking about space. More happens in the first 15 seconds than in any equivalent span of time you will ever experience on Earth. The vacuum of space does not kill slowly. It does not give warning. It does not negotiate. It simply begins a process, a ruthless, precise, biological countdown the moment you leave the last thin membrane of pressurized air behind. This is that countdown. What you are about to hear is not science fiction. It is not speculation drawn from dystopian novels or dramatic film sequences where astronauts explode or freeze solid the moment a helmet cracks. Those depictions are wrong, and in a strange way, they make the truth less interesting. The reality of what the vacuum of space does to a human body is far more intricate, far more biological, far more intimate than any film has ever portrayed. It is a story told in milliseconds and minutes, in dissolved gases and capillary beds, in eardrums and eye sockets, and the lining of your lungs. It is a story that science has pieced together not from tragedy, but from controlled experiments, animal studies, accidental exposures, and the careful study of what happens when the most complex biological machine in the known universe meets an environment it was never, in any conceivable evolutionary sense, designed to survive. So let us begin at the beginning, not at the moment of exposure, not yet, but at the moment just before. Because to understand what the vacuum of space does to a human body, you first need to understand what the vacuum of space actually is. And when you truly understand that, the 3-minute countdown becomes something different than a horror story. It becomes one of the most extraordinary things you will ever learn about the universe you live in. The word vacuum comes from the Latin for empty. And for most of human history, that is exactly what space was assumed to be. Nothing. A void. An absence so complete that it defied meaningful description. The ancient Greeks debated whether a true vacuum could even exist. Aristotle famously argued that it could not, that nature abhorred emptiness and would always find a way to fill it. He was wrong, of course, but he was wrong in an interesting direction, because the instinct behind his argument that emptiness is somehow unstable, that the universe tends to fill voids, is not entirely without merit when you look at it through a modern lens. The vacuum of space is not, strictly speaking, completely empty. This is one of the first things you learn when you move from the popular conception of space to the scientific one. Interplanetary space, the kind you encounter if you were to walk out of a spacecraft in the inner solar system, contains roughly 5 particles per cubic centimeter, mostly protons and electrons streaming outward from the sun in the solar wind. The interstellar medium, the space between stars, is even more sparse, about 1 atom per cubic centimeter on average. Deep intergalactic space approaches something closer to true emptiness, perhaps 1 atom per cubic meter. But here is the critical point, and this is where the countdown begins to feel real. Even in the relative neighborhood of Earth, even in low Earth orbit where the International Space Station circles the planet every 90 minutes, the pressure of space is so vanishingly small compared to the pressure of Earth's atmosphere that for every biological purpose that matters, it is functionally zero. The atmospheric pressure at sea level on Earth is approximately 101,325 pascals. The pressure in low Earth orbit is somewhere around 0.00001 pascals, or 100 billionth of what your body is experiencing right now. That ratio is not just a number, it is the entire story. Your body, right now, wherever you are, is being compressed on every surface by the weight of roughly 14 pounds of air per square inch. This pressure is invisible to you because it is balanced. The fluids inside your body push outward at the same pressure the atmosphere pushes inward. Your cells, your blood vessels, your lungs, your eardrums, all of them exist in a state of equilibrium that you have never once consciously maintained and have almost certainly never thought about. It simply is. It has been since before you were born. The pressure inside equals the pressure outside, and in that balance, you function. Now remove the outside pressure instantly, completely. That equilibrium, the one you have never thought about because it has never needed your attention, is gone. And the countdown begins. Second zero, the moment of exposure. Let us place you somewhere specific, because location matters in this story. You are aboard a spacecraft in low Earth orbit. The altitude is approximately 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. The temperature outside the spacecraft varies wildly depending on whether you are in sunlight or shadow, roughly plus 120 degrees Celsius in direct sunlight, minus 100 degrees Celsius in shadow. The radiation environment is measurably more intense than on Earth's surface, unfiltered by the magnetosphere's full protection at this altitude. The micrometeorite flux is statistically low but non-zero. None of these factors, not the temperature, not the radiation, not the micrometeoroids, are your most immediate problem. Your most immediate problem is the pressure differential. At second zero, the moment you step into vacuum without a suit, without any pressurized layer between your biology and the environment, the first thing that happens is something you might not expect. You do not freeze, you do not explode, you do not immediately lose consciousness. What happens first is something quiet, almost gentle by comparison to what follows. A sensation localized to your skin, your mouth, your throat. The moisture on the surface of your tongue and the soft tissue of your mouth begins to boil. Not because it is hot, because the pressure is gone. This is one of the most counterintuitive facts in all of human physiology, and it deserves to sit with you for a moment. Water boils when the vapor pressure of the liquid exceeds the surrounding atmospheric pressure. On Earth at sea level, that happens at 100 degrees Celsius. But lower the atmospheric pressure and the boiling point drops. Keep lowering it all the way to the near zero pressure of space, and water boils at body temperature, at 37 degrees Celsius. At the exact temperature your body maintains every hour of every day of your life. The moisture on your tongue, the saliva in your mouth, the thin film of fluid that coats every mucous membrane in your body, all of it boils, not violently, not in a way that you would probably call boiling in any intuitive sense. It vaporizes, it transitions from liquid to gas without the addition of a single degree of heat. And as it does, it produces a distinctive sensation that the handful of humans who have experienced partial vacuum exposure, have described in remarkably consistent terms a strange, cold, wet feeling, like the inside of your mouth going numb from the inside out. This is second one, maybe second two. And already something extraordinary is happening at the microscopic level inside you. To understand the next phase of the countdown, you need to understand a concept called ebullism. The word comes from the Latin ebullire, to boil up, and it refers specifically to the formation of vapor bubbles in the bodily fluids of a living organism due to reduced pressure rather than increased temperature. It is the physiological equivalent of what happens when you open a carbonated drink. Dissolved gases, released from solution by a sudden drop in pressure, forming bubbles that expand and migrate through whatever medium contains them. In the case of a carbonated drink, that medium is sugar water. The bubbles rise harmlessly to the surface and pop. In the case of a human being in vacuum, that medium is blood, lymph, tissue fluid, the aqueous humour of the eye, the fluid in the vestibular system of the inner ear, and every other water-based solution in the body. The bubbles do not rise harmlessly to a surface and pop. They form in your joints, your muscles, your organs. They expand. They push tissue apart. They interfere with blood flow. They cause pain. Not the sharp, localized pain of a cut or a bruise, but the deep, diffuse, whole-body agony that divers who ascend too quickly know as decompression sickness, as the bends, multiplied in speed and severity by the totality of the pressure change. Decompression sickness in divers occurs when nitrogen dissolved in the blood comes out of solution during a too rapid ascent. It is dangerous, occasionally fatal, and described by those who survive it as some of the worst pain they have ever experienced. The nitrogen comes out of solution because the partial pressure of nitrogen in the environment drops below the partial pressure in the blood, and physics demands equilibrium. Now, imagine that happening to every gas dissolved in your entire body simultaneously, across every tissue at once, driven not by a partial change in pressure from 30 meters of water to the surface, but by a total elimination of pressure from 1 atmosphere to essentially zero. This is ebullism, and in the vacuum of space it begins within seconds. The first physical sensation is the swelling. As gases come out of solution and water vaporizes in the tissues, the body begins to expand. Not explosively, not in the science fiction sense of a person bursting. The skin is far too elastic, and the process far too gas-driven rather than liquid-driven for that, but measurably, documentably, uncomfortably. Researchers who have studied the effects of vacuum exposure on animal subjects and who have examined the handful of accidental human exposures in pressure chamber accidents describe a body that visibly inflates, particularly in the extremities, the face, the torso. Pressure suits used by test pilots who have experienced explosive decompression accidents have recorded the suit filling with a body that has expanded noticeably within the first 15 to 20 seconds of vacuum exposure. You would feel this. It is not subtle. The pressure in your joints, the tightness across your skin, the sense of your own body pushing outward against itself from the inside. By second 10, this is already underway. But we need to go back to second 0 for a moment because something else is happening simultaneously that is, in the immediate term, even more critical than ebullism. Something that will determine whether you survive these 3 minutes at all, whether recovery is possible if you are pulled back into a pressurized environment, or whether the damage done in these first seconds is already too severe for your biology to repair. Your lungs. The lungs are the most vulnerable organ in this scenario, not because of what the vacuum does to them directly, but because of what you might do to them yourself. At the moment of sudden decompression, there is a powerful, instinctive, biological urge to gasp, to inhale. This is the same reflex that kicks in when you are startled, when you are hit, when anything sudden and overwhelming interrupts the rhythm of your breathing. The brainstem triggers it before conscious thought has time to intervene. And if you are in vacuum when this happens, you inhale nothing. There is nothing to inhale. The lungs expand in response to the diaphragm's contraction, reaching for air that is not there. This would be survivable on its own. A failed inhalation attempt is not catastrophic. What is catastrophic is the opposite, trying to hold your breath. If you hold your breath during rapid decompression, the air already in your lungs expands as the outside pressure drops. At sea level pressure, your lungs contain air at roughly 1 atmosphere. As the outside pressure drops towards zero, that air expands. The gas laws are unforgiving here. Boyle's law states that the volume of a gas is inversely proportional to the pressure applied to it at constant temperature. Halve the pressure, and the gas doubles in volume. Drop the pressure to near zero, and the gas expands to fill many times its original volume. There is not enough elasticity in human lung tissue to accommodate this expansion without catastrophic failure. Alveoli rupture. Air enters the chest cavity. In severe cases, air enters the bloodstream, a condition called arterial gas embolism, which can reach the brain within seconds and cause a stroke that begins before you have had time to consciously register that anything is wrong. This is why every astronaut, every test pilot, every person trained to work in pressure suits knows the single most important rule of rapid decompression. Do not hold your breath. Exhale, open your airway. Let the pressure equalize on its own terms rather than trapping the expanding gas inside you. But untrained, unprepared, caught by surprise in a pressure failure with no warning. The instinct to hold, to seal, to resist is powerful. And in the vacuum of space, acting on that instinct for even 2 or 3 seconds can turn a survivable emergency into a fatal one before the countdown has barely begun. By second 15, you are still conscious. This surprises people. The common assumption is that the vacuum of space kills instantly. And in the dramatic version of this story, the one Hollywood prefers, consciousness evaporates the moment the helmet comes off. But that is not what happens. That is not what the physiology says, and it is not what the evidence, slim as it is from real human exposure events, suggests. You are conscious at second 15, but your consciousness is already compromised. The swelling we discussed earlier is continuing. The embolism is progressing. The moisture on every surface of your respiratory tract is vaporizing, carrying body heat with it as it does, cooling your mouth and throat from the inside. Your skin is in contact with either intense solar radiation or the radiative cold of shadow, depending on your orientation. But neither of these is yet affecting your core body temperature significantly. Thermal transfer in vacuum is extremely slow in the absence of conduction and convection. You are not freezing, not yet. What you are doing is running out of oxygen, not because the vacuum is removing oxygen from your blood. Your blood already has oxygen in it. Red blood cells loaded with oxygen at the moment of exposure continue to circulate, continue to deliver that oxygen to your tissues for a period of time after exposure. What is happening is that no new oxygen is entering your lungs. The gas exchange that normally happens thousands of times per minute oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, has stopped. The blood returning to your lungs from the tissues carrying carbon dioxide and needing oxygen finds nothing to exchange with, and so oxygen saturation in your blood begins to drop. This process is called hypoxia, and it has a well-studied timeline in the absence of breathable air. At altitude where partial pressure of oxygen is reduced but not eliminated, pilots who lose pressurization can remain conscious for several minutes, even up to 15 or 20 minutes at moderate altitudes, before incapacitation occurs. But in the total absence of any oxygen source at the functional pressure of space, the timeline is much shorter. Research on the time of useful consciousness, the period during which a person can perform purposeful actions before hypoxia impairs judgment and coordination to the point of uselessness, suggests approximately 9 to 12 seconds at pressures approaching zero. 9 to 12 seconds. After that, your body is still alive. Your heart is still beating. Your cells are still consuming the oxygen already in your blood. But you are no longer in a meaningful sense directing your own actions. Your arms and legs may continue to move, but not purposefully. Your eyes may remain open, but not processing. Your consciousness, the part of you that is listening to these words right now, that is following this story, that is forming thoughts about what you are hearing, has gone dark. You are in the vacuum of space. 15 seconds have passed. You are unconscious, and you still have 2 minutes and 45 seconds remaining in your countdown. We will pick up at second 15 and follow this countdown through to its conclusion in the next part of this journey. But before we move forward, there is something worth sitting with, a thought that deserves a moment of quiet attention, because it changes the emotional weight of everything that follows. The human body, in those first 15 seconds, is not passive. It is not simply failing. It is responding. Every physiological process we have described, the vaporization of moisture, the formation of gas bubbles, the protective reflex to exhale, the rapid delivery of remaining oxygen to critical organs, every single one of these is the body doing what biology has equipped it to do: fighting, adapting, attempting, with the tools evolution gave it over 4 billion years of life on this planet, to survive a situation it was never designed to survive. The tragedy, if there is one, is not that the body fails. It is that it tries so hard and comes so close. 3 minutes, 180 seconds, and in the first 15 of them, more biological systems are engaged. More physiological responses triggered, more of the body's emergency protocols activated than in almost any other survival scenario the human animal can face. The question the next part of this story will answer is what happens in the remaining 165 seconds. What the body does when the oxygen runs out, when the swelling progresses, when the temperature differential finally begins to matter, and when, at some point between 2 and 3 minutes, the line is crossed from damage that can be repaired to damage that cannot. That line has a location. Science has found it, and it is closer to the beginning of the countdown than most people would want to believe. Second 15, you are unconscious. Let us be precise about what that means, because unconscious is a word that carries a lot of weight in common usage, and the kind of unconsciousness that hypoxia produces in the first 15 seconds of vacuum exposure is not the gentle, familiar darkness of sleep. It is not the brief flickering absence of a fainting spell. It is something closer to a sudden and total electrical failure in a building that was previously fully lit, every room dark at once, every system still running on backup power, but no longer coordinated by any central intelligence. Your brainstem is still active. It will remain active for some time yet. The brainstem is the oldest part of your brain in evolutionary terms, the part that manages the functions your body cannot afford to leave to conscious decision. Heartbeat, breathing reflex, blood pressure regulation, basic hormonal responses. It does not require the oxygen-hungry cerebral cortex to keep running. It runs on lower reserves, responds to simpler signals, and goes dark later in the hypoxic sequence than the higher brain functions that make you, recognizably, you. This distinction matters enormously for the countdown, because it means that even as your conscious mind has switched off, your body is still, in a biological sense, fighting. Your heart is still beating. At second 15, your heart rate has almost certainly spiked. The body's response to sudden decompression includes a powerful sympathetic nervous system activation, the same fight or flight cascade that would kick in if you were attacked by a predator or fell from a height. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, heart rate climbs. Peripheral blood vessels constrict as the body prioritizes blood flow to the core, to the brain, to the heart itself, at the expense of the skin and extremities. This is called peripheral vasoconstriction, and it is a deeply ancient survival mechanism, one designed to keep the most critical organs perfused with oxygenated blood for as long as possible when oxygen delivery is compromised. It is, in this situation, buying time. Not much, but measurably. The heart, squeezing harder and faster than normal, is pushing whatever oxygenated blood remains in circulation through the cerebral vasculature, through the coronary arteries feeding the heart muscle itself. The red blood cells loaded at the last moment before exposure are still delivering their oxygen molecules to the tissues that need them most. This reserve, the oxygen already in your blood at the moment the countdown began, is what the 9 to 12 second window of useful consciousness was drawing on. It is now depleted at the cortical level, which is why you are unconscious. But the deeper reserves, the oxygen bound in myoglobin in muscle tissue, the oxygen still in venous blood, not yet fully deoxygenated, continue to sustain the brainstem and the heart for longer. Precisely how much longer is one of the most carefully studied questions in space medicine, and the answer is both more hopeful and more terrifying than most people expect. The evidence base for what happens in human vacuum exposure is remarkably thin, given how fundamental the question is. This is not negligence on the part of researchers. It is a reflection of the fact that deliberately exposing human subjects to near vacuum conditions is ethically and practically impossible, and that accidental exposures, while they have occurred, are rare and typically brief enough that the subjects survived without full physiological documentation of the experience. The most significant documented case of human accidental vacuum exposure occurred in 1965 at the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, now the Johnson Space Center. A technician named Jim LeBlanc was testing a spacesuit in a large vacuum chamber when a hose connecting his suit to the pressurization system became disconnected. The suit depressurized rapidly. LeBlanc lost consciousness within approximately 14 seconds, which aligns precisely with what the physiology predicts. He described, in the last seconds before losing consciousness, feeling the saliva on his tongue begin to boil. The chamber was rapidly repressurized and LeBlanc was revived. He recovered fully. The total duration of vacuum exposure was estimated at approximately 27 seconds. 27 seconds. Survivable. Fully recoverable. That case established something enormously important. The human body can survive vacuum exposure of at least 20 to 30 seconds without permanent damage, provided repressurization occurs quickly. The tissues damaged during that exposure, the ruptured capillaries, the gas bubbles in the joints, the vaporization damage to mucous membranes, can heal. The brain, deprived of oxygen for the duration, but not long enough to suffer cell death in the higher cortical regions, can recover fully. Leblanc walked out of that chamber with nothing worse than a temporary ache in his joints and the vivid memory of his tongue going cold. But 27 seconds is not 3 minutes, and the question this countdown is really asking is what happens in the space between those two numbers, what changes between 27 seconds and 180 seconds. Where exactly is the line, and how does the body, still fighting at the brainstem level even as the cortex has gone dark, navigate the increasingly hostile territory between survivable and not? By second 30, the ebulism that began in the first few seconds has progressed significantly throughout the body's soft tissues. Let us trace what this looks like at the anatomical level, because the geography of ebulism matters. It is not uniform. It does not affect all tissues equally or simultaneously. The areas where it progresses fastest are the areas with the highest blood flow and the highest concentration of dissolved gases: the lungs, the gastrointestinal tract, the skin, and the large muscle groups. The areas where it progresses most slowly are the areas with lower metabolic activity and lower perfusion: dense connective tissue, bone, cartilage. In the lungs, the gas bubbles that form during ebulism are particularly dangerous, not because the lungs cannot handle gas. They are, after all, designed to handle gas, but because the gas forming from ebulism is not coming from outside, it is coming from inside, from the blood itself, from the tissues of the alveolar walls, from the fluid lining the airways. Bubbles forming in the pulmonary vasculature can block blood flow through the lungs, creating what is effectively an air embolism in the vessels designed to carry blood through the gas exchange surface. This is called pulmonary embolism, and in its terrestrial form, caused by blood clots rather than gas bubbles, it is a leading cause of cardiac death. The gas bubble version produced by ebulism is no less dangerous to the delicate architecture of the lung. In the skin, the process is visible. Studies on animals subjected to near-vacuum conditions have documented the skin swelling to roughly twice its normal thickness within 30 to 60 seconds, driven by gas formation and tissue fluid redistribution. The face, the hands, the exposed surfaces of the body balloon outward. This is not aesthetic damage. The swelling compresses the capillary beds in the skin, reducing blood flow to the surface tissues. It stretches the nerve endings in the dermis. If you were conscious at this point, and you are not, you would be in significant pain from this alone. The deep, bone-level ache of decompression sickness, amplified across every square centimetre of your body simultaneously. In the joints, gas bubbles collecting in the synovial fluid, the lubricating fluid that cushions the articulation surfaces of your knees, hips, shoulders, and elbows, cause those joints to lock and distend. The nitrogen and other dissolved gases in the synovial fluid come out of solution for precisely the same reason they do in a diver ascending too fast, but compressed into seconds rather than minutes. The joints of the fingers, the wrists, the ankles, all of them simultaneously experiencing the worst decompression sickness attack in the history of human physiology, all at once, all progressing together. And yet, the heart is still beating. Second 45. The cardiovascular story is becoming more complicated now. The heart, which spiked in rate at the moment of exposure, is beginning to struggle. The blood it is pumping has changed character since second zero. It is carrying fewer oxygen molecules per milliliter as the red blood cells continue to deliver to the tissues but are not being recharged at the pulmonary exchange surface. It is carrying gas bubbles from the embolism process, bubbles that make blood behave less like a fluid and more like a foam. Bubbles that reduce its capacity to flow smoothly through the smallest vessels, the capillaries, the arterioles, the venues where the actual delivery of oxygen to individual cells occurs. The heart muscle itself is beginning to experience the effects of oxygen deprivation, not catastrophically, not yet, but measurably. The cardiac cells, the cardiomyocytes, are highly sensitive to hypoxia. They respond initially by increasing their rate of contraction, trying to compensate for reduced oxygen delivery by moving more blood faster. This is why the heart rate spikes in hypoxic conditions. But sustained oxygen deprivation beyond this initial compensation phase begins to impair the electrical conduction system of the heart, the network of specialized cells that times and coordinates each heartbeat. Arrhythmias, irregular rhythms that disrupt the efficient pumping action, become increasingly likely as hypoxia at the cardiac level deepens. This progression, from tachycardia to arrhythmia to cardiac failure, is the core of the 3-minute timeline. It is not primarily the lungs that kill you in vacuum exposure. It is not the embolism, though that contributes. It is not the temperature, which, as we will discuss, has not had time to significantly affect core body temperature, even by the 3-minute mark. It is the heart. The heart stops when the brain stops coordinating it, when the brainstem finally loses enough oxygen to maintain the electrical impulses that keep the cardiac conduction system running, and when the cardiac cells themselves are too deprived to respond even to those impulses. But we are not there yet at second 45. The heart is still beating, still arrhythmic, still foam-pumping blood gas mixture through increasingly compromised vessels, but beating. Here is something that the countdown demands we address directly, because it is one of the most common and most dramatically compelling questions people ask when this topic comes up. Are you in pain? During those first 15 seconds before unconsciousness, yes. The evidence from LeBlanc and from animal studies and from decompression sickness research suggests the answer is almost certainly yes. The joint pain of embolism beginning in the first seconds, the strange cold burning of moisture vaporizing from mucous membranes, the stretching sensation of tissue swelling, the sharp discomfort of the lung response to sudden decompression. These are painful stimuli arriving all at once, and while the sympathetic nervous system activation that accompanies the fight or flight response can partially blunt acute pain through the release of endogenous opioids, it does not eliminate it. The first 15 seconds, if you are untrained and unprepared, are almost certainly deeply unpleasant. After second 15, after consciousness has gone, the question of pain becomes philosophically complicated in a way that the science alone cannot fully resolve. The brainstem remains active. The brainstem processes pain signals. It routes them, responds to them, drives physiological responses to them without any involvement of the conscious mind. This is the mechanism behind the phenomenon of surgical patients who show clear physiological pain responses, elevated heart rate, increased blood pressure, pupil dilation, even when fully anesthetized and completely unconscious. The body responds to painful stimuli independently of conscious awareness, so the body in vacuum between second 15 and the eventual cessation of brainstem activity is likely processing pain signals. The joints, the skin, the internal organs, all of them sending distress signals along the nociceptive pathways, the brainstem receiving those signals and generating responses, but there is no one home to experience the pain. The suffering, in any meaningful sense, requires a conscious experiencer, and that experiencer went dark at second 15. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem. It is the difference between an experience of agony and a process of biological failure that merely resembles agony from the outside. The body in vacuum looks like it is suffering. It is not, in any experiential sense, suffering. The suffering ended with consciousness. What continues is the biological machinery running out its remaining reserve, still following its programming, still executing its emergency protocols, but no longer illuminated by any inner light. By the 1-minute mark, 60 seconds in, the external appearance of the body has changed significantly. The swelling, driven by embolism and tissue fluid redistribution, has progressed to the point where the body looks meaningfully different from how it looked at second 0. The face is particularly affected. The eyelids have swollen, potentially forcing the eyes partially closed. The lips and tongue, already affected by moisture vaporization, are further swollen. The skin across the entire body has a puffy, distended quality that emergency medicine personnel who have dealt with severe decompression sickness cases recognize as characteristic of massive embolism. The extremities, the hands and feet, are noticeably larger than normal. There is bruising forming under the skin, not from impact, but from the rupture of tiny capillaries throughout the subcutaneous tissue. The same pressure differential that is driving embolism in the large, fluid compartments of the body is also affecting the smallest blood vessels, where the pressure difference between the inside of the vessel and the outside environment is enough to cause mechanical failure of the vessel wall. Thousands of tiny capillaries rupture simultaneously across the surface of the skin, creating the appearance of a full-body bruise developing in real time. The medical term for this kind of small vessel bleeding under the skin is petechiae, when the hemorrhages are pinpoint-sized, and purpura, when they coalesce into larger patches. In vacuum exposure, both occur. The eyes are of particular interest at this stage, and for a reason that is both medically significant and, in a strange way, one of the most visually distinctive features of severe vacuum exposure. The eyes contain 2 fluid-filled chambers, the anterior chamber in front of the lens filled with aqueous humor, and the vitreous chamber behind the lens filled with the gelatinous, vitreous humor. Both of these fluids are subject to the same vaporization and gas formation processes as the rest of the body's fluids. In the anterior chamber, where the fluid is more liquid and more accessible to the pressure differential, rapid vaporization and gas formation can cause the eye to visibly expand, pushing outward against the elastic tissues of the sclera and cornea. The vessels of the conjunctiva, the thin membrane covering the white of the eye, are extremely delicate, and the pressure differential causes widespread rupture of these vessels, filling the white of the eye with blood, a condition called subconjunctival hemorrhage. In extreme decompression cases, the eyeballs can protrude visibly from the orbits as the intraocular pressure driven by gas formation exceeds the resistance of the surrounding tissues. All of this is occurring by the 60-second mark, and the process is still progressing. 60 seconds also brings us to the question of temperature, which we have so far set aside, but which cannot be ignored indefinitely. The vacuum of space has no temperature in the sense that air on Earth has a temperature. Temperature, as we experience it in everyday life, is a measure of the kinetic energy of molecules in a medium. Hot air contains molecules moving fast. Cold air contains molecules moving more slowly. When you feel cold air on your skin, what you are feeling is the faster molecules of your body giving their kinetic energy to the slower molecules of the cold air, cooling the surface of your skin in the process. This is convective heat transfer, and it is the dominant mechanism by which your body exchanges heat with its environment under normal terrestrial conditions. In vacuum, there are essentially no molecules to transfer heat to. Convective heat transfer cannot occur. Conductive heat transfer, the kind that happens when you touch a cold surface, also cannot occur unless your body is in contact with something. That leaves only one mechanism of heat exchange between your body and the space environment: radiation. Every object above absolute zero radiates energy in the form of electromagnetic radiation. Your body radiates primarily in the infrared range, and at 37 degrees Celsius, it radiates at a meaningful rate. This is how infrared cameras detect living bodies. Your body is constantly broadcasting its thermal energy outward as radiation. In vacuum, this radiated energy is lost to space. You are cooling, but slowly. How slowly? The numbers here are actually reassuring compared to the popular conception of instant freezing in space. The human body at rest radiates roughly 80 to 100 watts of thermal energy. A 70-kilogram body has a heat capacity sufficient to store many thousands of watt-hours of thermal energy. The rate of cooling by radiation alone is measurable in hours, not minutes, and certainly not seconds. At the 1-minute mark, your core body temperature has dropped by perhaps a fraction of a degree if you are in shadow. If you are in direct sunlight, the incoming solar radiation, approximately 1,360 watts per square meter in low Earth orbit, may actually be adding heat to the sun-facing side of your body faster than the shadow side is losing it. You are not freezing at 1 minute. You are not at risk of death by hypothermia for many, many minutes after the point at which every other physiological process in this countdown will have already concluded its work. The space instant freeze is a myth. The timeline of vacuum exposure has no room for it. By 90 seconds, a minute and a half, we have reached what researchers in aerospace medicine sometimes refer to informally as the commitment point. The moment at which the accumulation of physiological damage, even if repressurization were to occur immediately, begins to exceed the body's ability to fully recover. This is not a precisely defined threshold. It is not a moment that can be identified with a stopwatch. It is a zone, a range from roughly 90 seconds to 2 minutes, during which the probability of full recovery begins to decline sharply, even with perfect medical intervention immediately following repressurization. Before this zone, the damage is real but reversible. The embolism, caught early enough, resolves when pressure is restored. The gas bubbles in the joints and tissues reabsorb as the pressure differential that created them disappears. The ruptured capillaries in the skin heal. The mucous membranes regenerate. The heart, restored to a pressurized, oxygen-containing environment, can recover from the arrhythmias and resume normal conduction. The brain, deprived of oxygen but not long enough for cell death to occur in the cortical regions, boots back up. Jim LeBlanc, back on his feet after 27 seconds, is the proof of this. But at 90 seconds, certain processes have progressed past the point where simple repressurization reverses them. The most critical of these is in the heart itself. The cardiac muscle cells, the cardiomyocytes, have now been operating in a state of progressive oxygen deprivation for a minute and a half. At this level of sustained hypoxia, the first cardiac cells begin to die. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some, the cells in the subendocardial layer closest to the ventricular cavities, the cells that receive their oxygen supply last in the coronary circulation hierarchy. These begin to undergo irreversible cell death, the process we call myocardial infarction, when it occurs in the terrestrial setting of a blocked coronary artery. The heart can sustain significant myocardial infarction and continue to function imperfectly, arrhythmically, but functionally. The human heart is overbuilt in this respect, with a meaningful reserve capacity that allows it to keep pumping even after losing a portion of its working muscle. But each additional second of hypoxia beyond the 90-second mark adds to the cumulative damage. At 90 seconds, the countdown changes character. Before 90 seconds, the question is, can we get you back? After 90 seconds, the question becomes, how much of you can we get back, and at what cost? The brain, meanwhile, has been managing its oxygen reserves with extraordinary efficiency for the past minute and a half. The brain accounts for roughly 2% of body weight but consumes approximately 20% of the body's total oxygen budget under normal conditions. It is the most metabolically demanding organ in the body and correspondingly the most sensitive to oxygen deprivation. But it is not uniform in its sensitivity. The brainstem, as noted, is considerably more hypoxia-resistant than the cerebral cortex. The deeper structures of the brain, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the basal ganglia, fall somewhere in between. And within the cortex itself, some regions are more vulnerable than others. The hippocampus, critical for memory formation, is particularly sensitive to hypoxic damage and begins to show cell death at a lower oxygen deprivation threshold than most other cortical regions. This gradient of hypoxic vulnerability means that as the countdown progresses through the 90-second zone toward 2 minutes, the brain is not dying uniformly. It is failing from the outside in, from the most recently evolved and most metabolically demanding structures toward the ancient core. The cortex goes first, as we established at second 15. The limbic structures and basal ganglia follow somewhere in the 1 to 2 minute range. The brainstem holds on longest of all. The practical consequence of this gradient is that even at the 2 minute mark, even as the prospects for full neurological recovery are diminishing with each passing second, the brainstem is still doing its job, still sending electrical impulses to the heart, still maintaining whatever vestige of respiratory reflex it can manage in an environment with nothing to breathe, still regulating blood pressure through the peripheral vasculature, constricting vessels to maintain perfusion of the core. The ancient parts of the brain, the parts that were doing this work hundreds of millions of years before the cortex evolved, are the last to give up. This is not heroism. It is not will. It is simply the hierarchy of oxygen priority that evolution built into every vertebrate nervous system that has ever lived. And it means that the countdown to death is longer than the countdown to unconsciousness by a considerable margin. You went unconscious at second 15. The body, brainstem driving it, is still fighting at the 2 minute mark. We are approaching the final section of this part of the countdown, and before we move, which will take us through the critical 2 to 3 minute window and the threshold that scientists call the point of irreversibility, there is something that deserves to be said about the nature of what we are describing. This countdown, 180 seconds in a universe 13.8 billion years old, is absurdly short, The star that your planet orbits has been burning for 4.6 billion years. The galaxy your star inhabits has existed for approximately 12 billion years. The universe itself, from its first second to its last, spans a timeline so vast that a human lifetime is less than a rounding error in its accounting. And yet here, in this story, 3 minutes is the entire arc. 3 minutes is the distance between a living person and the end of that person. There is something philosophically vertiginous about that ratio. The same universe that takes 100 billion years to cool to its final state, that measures the lives of stars in millions and billions of years, the same universe kills the most complex arrangement of matter we have ever discovered in 3 minutes, if that arrangement finds itself in the wrong place without the right protection. Not because the universe is malevolent, not because there is any intention behind it, but because the conditions that gave rise to life, the warmth, the pressure, the chemical richness, the carefully maintained equilibrium of Earth's surface environment are extraordinarily rare, and the vast majority of the universe's volume is simply incompatible with the particular chemistry that makes a heartbeat possible. 3 minutes is not a failure of the human body. It is a testament to how precisely, how narrowly, how specifically the human body is calibrated to one small corner of one small planet orbiting one unremarkable star. The countdown continues where we enter the final minute, reach the 2-minute threshold, and ask the question that every space medicine researcher has spent careers trying to answer precisely. Where, exactly, does the line fall? 2 minutes, 120 seconds have elapsed since the moment of exposure. The countdown has now entered its final third, the zone that aerospace medicine researchers, physiologists, and the small community of scientists who have dedicated careers to understanding the limits of human survival in extreme environments regard as the most consequential stretch of the entire sequence. Not because this is where death becomes possible, death became possible much earlier than this, but because this is where death becomes, in the absence of immediate and perfect intervention, increasingly probable. Let us take stock of where the body is at the 2-minute mark, because the inventory is important for understanding what the final 60 seconds of the countdown will bring. The heart is beating. Not normally. The rhythm is irregular, driven by a cardiac conduction system that is increasingly oxygen-deprived, generating the kind of arrhythmias that in a terrestrial hospital would have a crash cart rolling across the floor and a defibrillator charging. The specific arrhythmia most likely at this stage is a progression from the initial tachycardia through a phase of increasingly disorganized electrical activity in the ventricles, the large pumping chambers, heading toward ventricular fibrillation, the chaotic quivering of the ventricular muscle that produces no effective pumping action at all and is, without intervention, uniformly fatal. The blood being moved by this struggling heart is increasingly compromised. The gas bubbles from embolism have had 2 full minutes to grow, migrate, and accumulate. The largest concentrations are in the right side of the heart and the pulmonary vasculature, where blood returning from the body's tissues enters the heart before being pumped through the lungs. Gas accumulation in the right heart creates what is called an airlock, a situation where the compressibility of gas prevents the heart from building the pressure differential needed to push blood forward. A liquid-filled pump works because liquids are incompressible. Fill the pump with gas, and the compression stroke compresses the gas rather than expelling the liquid, and blood flow through the system falters. The brainstem is still active, running on reserves that should, by any reasonable calculation, have been exhausted before now, maintained by the body's progressive redirection of every remaining resource toward the structures that matter most. The peripheral circulation has been sacrificed. The skin, the muscles of the extremities, the digestive system, all have been progressively starved of blood flow as the peripheral vasculature has constricted to preserve perfusion of the brain and heart. Your hands and feet at this point are, biologically speaking, already beyond recovery. The cells in the skin and superficial muscles of the extremities have been without meaningful oxygen delivery for long enough that the process of ischemic cell death is well underway. But the brainstem has been protected, and so it continues. The 2-minute mark is also where we need to address one of the most important and least understood aspects of this entire countdown, a physiological response that is both deeply counterintuitive and critically important for understanding why the 3-minute window, specifically, has emerged as the boundary that researchers point to. It is called the diving reflex. The diving reflex, also known as the mammalian diving response, is one of the most ancient survival mechanisms in the vertebrate physiological repertoire. It evolved, as its name suggests, in the context of breath-hold diving, the situation faced by marine mammals and by human freedivers when they submerge and must sustain life on a fixed oxygen reserve for as long as possible. But the reflex is triggered not only by submersion, it is triggered by any combination of breath holding and facial cooling, and it is present to some degree in every healthy human being. What it does in its full expression is extraordinary. It simultaneously reduces the heart rate, sometimes dramatically, to as low as 10 to 20% of normal through a process called bradycardia. It causes intense peripheral vasoconstriction, cutting blood flow to the muscles and skin while maintaining it to the heart and brain. It causes the spleen to contract, releasing a bolus of stored red blood cells into the circulation and temporarily increasing the oxygen-carrying capacity of the blood, and it shifts the metabolic profile of the peripheral tissues toward anaerobic metabolism, allowing them to continue functioning without oxygen for longer than they normally could, by burning glucose without the oxygen-dependent steps of aerobic respiration and accepting the metabolic debt that comes with the accumulation of lactic acid. Together, these changes extend the time that the brain and heart can survive on a fixed oxygen reserve by a factor that varies between individuals, but that in trained free divers can be quite remarkable. Competitive free divers regularly hold their breath for 5, 6, 7 minutes, and the world record for a static breath hold exceeds 24 minutes. These feats are only possible because the diving reflex allows the body to enter a state of dramatically reduced metabolic demand while ruthlessly prioritizing the delivery of remaining oxygen to the tissues that cannot survive without it. Now, here is the critical question for our countdown. Is the diving reflex active during vacuum exposure? The honest answer is partially, and under some conditions, possibly significantly. The face cooling component of the diving reflex trigger is relevant in vacuum exposure because while the body as a whole is not cooling rapidly by radiation alone, the mucous membranes of the face and upper respiratory tract are cooling rapidly through the vaporization of moisture, a process that carries substantial heat away from those surfaces. This evaporative cooling of the facial mucosa may be sufficient to trigger at least a partial diving reflex response, even in the absence of water submersion. The breath hold component is more complicated. You are not consciously holding your breath. You are in an environment with nothing to breathe. Whether the brainstem interprets this as breath holding in the sense required to trigger the full diving reflex, or whether it interprets it as something else entirely, is not definitively established by the available research. But the physiological evidence from the handful of accidental human vacuum exposures and from animal studies conducted specifically to investigate this question suggests that something like the diving reflex does engage during vacuum exposure. The documented cases of survival at exposure durations that the straight-line oxygen depletion math would suggest should be fatal hint at a metabolic conservation response that extends the survivability window beyond what simple calculation would predict. This is part of why the 3-minute boundary, rather than a shorter one, is where researchers place the edge of survivability. The diving reflex, or something functionally similar, is buying time in these final minutes. Not enough time, but time. At the 2-minute mark, with the diving reflex partially engaged, with the heart still struggling through its arrhythmias, with the brainstem still sending its ancient signals, something else begins that we have not yet discussed. Something that operates on a longer time scale than the immediate physiological crisis, but that becomes relevant at this stage of the countdown because its consequences begin to overlap with the acute injury timeline. Radiation. In low Earth orbit, the radiation environment is measurably more intense than at Earth's surface. The magnetosphere provides significant protection, deflecting most of the solar wind and cosmic ray flux, but it is not perfect protection, particularly at the higher inclinations of the ISS orbit, where the inner Van Allen belt dips closer to the station's altitude. An unprotected human body in LEO is exposed to a radiation dose roughly equivalent to a few hundred microsieverts per day, compared to the roughly 2 to 3 millisieverts per year of background radiation at Earth's surface. In the context of a 3-minute exposure, this radiation dose is utterly trivial. 3 minutes in, LEO adds perhaps a fraction of a microsievert to the body's lifetime radiation dose, an amount so small that it is literally undetectable against the statistical noise of normal background radiation exposure. Radiation is simply not a meaningful factor in a 3-minute vacuum exposure scenario. The ionizing radiation in low Earth orbit will not contribute to death, injury, or any detectable biological effect over this timescale. Where radiation becomes relevant is in scenarios where the vacuum exposure occurs outside the protection of the magnetosphere, in deep space, or during a solar energetic particle event, a solar flare or coronal mass ejection that floods the inner solar system with a surge of high-energy protons and electrons. In those scenarios, the radiation dose rate can spike by orders of magnitude for hours or days at a time. But even then, radiation sickness develops over days and weeks, not seconds and minutes. It is a concern for the longer survival scenarios, the ones where other aspects of this countdown do not resolve the question first. For 3 minutes in low Earth orbit, radiation is not your problem. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The heart is now in a state of sustained compromise from which, even with repressurization, recovery will require significant medical intervention. The arrhythmias have deepened. The myocardial infarction that began at the 90-second mark, initially affecting only the most vulnerable subendocardial cells, has extended further into the thickness of the ventricular wall. The right ventricle, working against the airlocked pulmonary circuit, is particularly stressed. The brain is entering the zone where even the brainstem's oxygen reserves are becoming critically depleted. The hierarchy of hypoxic tolerance within the brainstem, means that the most recently evolved and most metabolically active brainstem structures begin to fail before the most ancient ones. The respiratory control centers in the medulla, which have been sending increasingly futile breathing signals to a diaphragm that has been contracting against an empty chest, begin to lose their consistent rhythmicity. The signals become irregular. The breathing movements, if they could be observed, would show a pattern called Cheney-Stokes breathing. Alternating bursts of rapid respiratory movement and periods of apnea, cessation of the effort entirely. That is the characteristic signature of a brainstem losing its oxygen supply. Simultaneously, the cardiovascular control centers of the brainstem are struggling to maintain the peripheral vasoconstriction that has been the cornerstone of the body's survival strategy from the beginning of the countdown. As these centers fail, the peripheral vessels begin to relax. Blood that has been centralized, kept away from the skin and muscles and concentrated in the core, begins to redistribute. The blood pressure, which has been maintained by this vasoconstriction despite the compromised cardiac output, begins to fall. The fall in blood pressure reduces perfusion of the brainstem itself, creating a feedback loop of deepening hypoxia and failing cardiovascular control that, without intervention, resolves in only one direction: 2 minutes and 30 seconds. We have now crossed what many researchers consider the practical point of no return, not for the body. The heart may still be beating weakly, the brain stem may still be generating signals, but for the person, for the neurological substrate that makes someone who they are. The hippocampus is among the most hypoxia-sensitive structures in the brain. It is also, in a very real sense, among the most humanly significant. The hippocampus is the structure through which new long-term memories are consolidated. It is the structure that maps the spatial relationships of your environment and your position within it. It is the structure that connects the immediate present to the remembered past and allows you to navigate not just physical space, but biographical continuity, the sense of being a self with a history that persists through time. Hippocampal cell death begins earlier in the hypoxic sequence than cell death in most other brain structures. By 2.5 minutes of total cerebral hypoxia, the damage to the hippocampus is significant, not total. The brain is not uniformly destroyed at this point, but the selective vulnerability of the hippocampus means that even in cases where the countdown is interrupted at this stage, even in cases where repressurization occurs and the heart is restarted and the gross survival of the organism is achieved, the specific damage to the hippocampus may be permanent. The person who regains consciousness after this kind of anoxic injury may find themselves in a world that they recognize but cannot update. They may remember everything before the event clearly, perhaps with the crystalline, unusual clarity that sometimes accompanies memories formed in states of extreme stress. But forming new memories, converting the experiences of the next hour, the next day, the next month into the kind of durable long-term memory that allows you to say what you did yesterday or recognize your doctor from a previous visit. This capacity may be gone. This is the specific horror of severe anoxic brain injury that clinicians and neurologists who work with cardiac arrest survivors encounter regularly. The brain can survive. The person can walk and talk and feel and respond. But something fundamental about how they relate to time, about the continuity of their self through time, can be permanently disrupted by the death of those few 100,000 cells in the hippocampal formation. At 2.5 minutes into a vacuum exposure, this damage is occurring. But here, in this third part of the countdown, as we approach the most difficult territory, it is worth pausing to look at this story from an entirely different angle. Not the angle of failure and damage and death, but the angle of what these 3 minutes reveal about life. Consider what we have observed in this countdown: a body suddenly and completely deprived of every environmental condition that it evolved to require, fighting back with a specificity and elegance that is, if you look at it clearly, extraordinary. The diving reflex extending the window, the peripheral vasoconstriction concentrating resources where they matter most, the brainstem outlasting the cortex, the ancient structures protecting the newer ones for as long as possible, the heart continuing to beat through arrhythmias that would stop a less robust pump, the cells of the skin accepting ischemia so that the cells of the myocardium can receive the last molecules of oxygen. None of this was designed for space, none of this evolved in response to vacuum exposure. These mechanisms evolved in response to drowning, to extreme cold, to predator attacks that cut blood flow to the extremities, to the 1,000 other ways that life on this planet has tried to kill the animals that carry them. They are solutions to a different set of problems. And yet here, in the most alien environment a human body has ever encountered, those ancient solutions are still running, still executing, still doing exactly what they were built to do, which is to buy time, to preserve the possibility of survival for as long as biology allows. The vacuum of space is not a context that evolution anticipated, but the body's response to it is recognizably, unmistakably biological. The same body that developed in a warm, wet, pressurized womb, that grew up breathing air and drinking water and living under the gravitational and atmospheric conditions of this one particular planet, is doing what all life does when threatened. It is refusing to die easily. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The cardiovascular control centers of the brainstem have failed. Blood pressure has fallen to levels insufficient to maintain perfusion of any tissue. The heart, now receiving no signals from the brainstem and no oxygen through the coronary arteries, is entering the final phase of electrical disorganization. The ventricular fibrillation that has been approaching since the 90-second mark is now established or imminently approaching. The heart is no longer pumping. The coordinated contraction that we call a heartbeat has dissolved into the chaotic, ineffective quivering of individual cardiomyocytes firing without coordination, consuming the last of their intracellular energy stores in movements that move no blood. Clinical death, by the standard medical definition of the cessation of cardiac and respiratory function, is either occurring now or will occur within the next 15 to 30 seconds. But clinical death is not biological death. And this distinction, which matters enormously in the emergency medicine context, is critical here. Clinical death is the cessation of the mechanical functions that circulate oxygen through the body. Biological death is the irreversible cessation of all cellular activity, the point at which the cells themselves have consumed their final energy reserves and begun to break down. In the interval between clinical death and biological death, which can range from minutes to, under ideal conditions of metabolic suppression such as hypothermia, potentially hours, the cells of the body remain structurally intact, metabolically active at a reduced level, and theoretically capable of resuming normal function if oxygen is restored. This interval is the basis of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It is the basis of targeted temperature management in cardiac arrest. It is the basis of the entire science of resuscitation medicine, which has learned to push the boundary of biological death further and further from clinical death by manipulating the metabolic conditions in the post-arrest body. In the vacuum exposure scenario, the interval between clinical and biological death is shortened by the compounding injuries of embolism, by the extensive myocardial damage, by the radiation of heat from the cooling body surfaces. But it is not eliminated. The cells of the brain, even the cells that are most vulnerable to hypoxia, do not die instantaneously at the moment the heart stops. They continue to consume their local energy stores to maintain their membrane integrity, to remain theoretically resuscitable for some period of time after clinical death. How long? The answer depends on temperature, on the extent of prior ischemic damage, on individual variation, on factors that no controlled experiment has been able to measure in the specific context of vacuum exposure. But the number that emergency physicians use as a rough guide for the window of cerebral resuscitability following cardiac arrest in normothermic conditions, roughly 4 to 6 minutes from cardiac arrest, to irreversible neurological damage, is a starting point. At the 3-minute mark of vacuum exposure, clinical death has either just occurred or is occurring. The window of cerebral resuscitability that follows cardiac arrest has just opened. A window of perhaps 4 to 6 minutes now counting down from the moment the heart stopped, which means, remarkably, that the 3-minute mark is not simply an ending. In certain, very specific, very demanding circumstances, it is also a beginning. A beginning of what, precisely, is the subject of the next part of this journey, because the 3-minute countdown is not actually the end of this story. It is the most dramatic chapter, the chapter where the acute crisis reaches its climax, but the story of what vacuum exposure does to a human body does not end at the last heartbeat. It continues in the minutes after, in the hours after, and in the cases of those few individuals who have survived meaningful vacuum exposure and returned to pressurized environments in the weeks and months after. The damage inflicted in these 3 minutes has a geography, a severity gradient, a pattern of injury that emergency medicine and space medicine researchers have worked to understand precisely so that when, not if, a more severe vacuum exposure incident occurs in the history of human spaceflight, the people responsible for responding to it will know what they are dealing with. It will ask what happens when the countdown is interrupted, when repressurization occurs at various points in the 3-minute window, when the body is brought back from the edge of the cliff or from over it. It will ask what the body looks like in the aftermath, what can be repaired and what cannot, what the survivors of partial vacuum exposure have reported about the experience from the other side of it, and it will ask the question that haunts everyone who thinks seriously about the future of our human spaceflight. How close have we actually come in the history of the space age to this countdown reaching its end? The answers are closer than you think, more specific than you would expect, and in at least one case, more sobering than any dramatization of space disaster has ever managed to convey. The countdown has run its course. 3 minutes have elapsed. Clinical death has occurred or is imminent. The body floating in the vacuum of space is not the body that crossed the threshold 180 seconds ago. It is the same mass of cells, the same arrangement of tissue and bone and fluid, but the organization that made it a living system, the coordinated electrochemical conversation between heart and brain and lung that we call life, has either fallen silent or is falling silent now. The embolism has swollen the tissues to grotesque dimensions. The capillary hemorrhages have mapped the entire surface of the skin in purple and red. The eyes, protruding slightly from their orbits, stare at nothing. The heart if it is still moving at all, is fibrillating in the darkness of the chest cavity, generating heat but no flow. This is the image that the 3-minute countdown produces when it runs uninterrupted. But the 3-minute countdown in the real history of human spaceflight and aerospace medicine has almost never run uninterrupted. The cases that matter, the ones that have actually shaped our understanding of what vacuum exposure does to a human body, are the cases where the countdown was interrupted, where something intervened, where the person was pulled back from the threshold or retrieved from just beyond it, and the process of repair and assessment and recovery began. These cases are the other half of this story, and in some ways they are more illuminating than the theoretical endpoint of an uninterrupted countdown, because they tell us not just what the vacuum does, but what the body does next, how it heals or fails to heal, what it remembers and what it forgets, what it is like to have been, however briefly, on the wrong side of the boundary that separates the livable universe from the rest of it. Let us begin with what repressurization actually does, the mechanics of rescue, because this is not simply the countdown running in reverse. When pressure is restored to a body that has undergone vacuum exposure, the gas bubbles that formed through ebulism do not simply dissolve back into solution instantaneously. They reabsorb, but on a time scale governed by diffusion and perfusion, by how quickly blood flow can be restored to the affected tissues and how efficiently the redissolved gas can be carried away by the circulation. In mild decompression sickness cases, this process resolves over hours to days with supportive care. In severe ebulism, the kind produced by vacuum exposure of more than a few seconds, the gas bubble burden is so much larger than anything seen in diving accidents that the reabsorption process is correspondingly longer and the potential for lasting damage correspondingly higher. The primary treatment for decompression sickness, including the gas bubble component of vacuum exposure injury, is hyperbaric oxygen therapy, placing the patient in a pressurized chamber at above atmospheric pressure while breathing pure oxygen. The increased pressure directly compresses and shrinks the gas bubbles. The high oxygen concentration accelerates the replacement of nitrogen in the bubbles with oxygen, which is metabolically consumed by the tissues and therefore disappears faster than inert nitrogen would. The combination dramatically accelerates bubble resolution and reduces the ischemic damage caused by bubble-blocked vessels. In the scenario we have been following, immediate hyperbaric treatment following repressurization would be a priority. But the body arriving at the hyperbaric chamber after 3 minutes of vacuum exposure is not simply a decompression sickness patient. It is a patient with cardiac arrest, anoxic brain injury, extensive skin and mucous membrane injury, pulmonary damage from ebulism and pressure trauma, and the compound systemic effects of total body ischemia for 3 minutes. This is not a single medical emergency. It is every medical emergency happening simultaneously in the same body. The Jim LeBlanc case represents the most optimistic end of the survival spectrum. 27 seconds of exposure, immediate repressurization, full recovery. It is the proof of concept that vacuum exposure is survivable. But it sits at one extreme of a spectrum, and the other extreme, 3 minutes or beyond, sits at the opposite end of a spectrum that the history of space medicine has only partially filled in. The cases between these extremes are sparse, imperfectly documented, and in some instances classified or embedded in accident reports that were not designed with physiological research in mind. But they exist, and they tell a consistent story about how the injury profile changes as exposure duration increases. There are documented cases of partial pressure, suit failures during high-altitude aircraft operations, not true vacuum, but pressures low enough to produce meaningful embolism, where pilots lost consciousness and were recovered by the automatic pressurization systems of their suits before the situation became fatal. These cases, occurring at altitudes where the pressure is perhaps 1 to 2% of sea level rather than the effectively 0% of space, involve a slower version of the same physiological cascade. The pilots who experienced these events and survived describe a consistent sequence: the awareness of the mouth going cold and strange, the sensation of the suit inflating around them as their bodies began to swell, and then nothing until they regained consciousness in a pressurized environment with joint pain and a headache that lasted for days. The joint pain in these cases was the residual effect of gas bubbles in the synovial fluid that had partially resolved with repressurization but left behind micro tears in the cartilage and synovial membrane. The headache was consistent with cerebral edema, swelling of brain tissue in response to the hypoxic insult, a consequence of the blood-brain barrier becoming temporarily more permeable under the oxidative stress of anoxia. Both of these symptoms resolved over days to weeks in the documented cases, with no lasting neurological deficit identified at follow-up. But these were short exposures. The longer ones tell a different story. The most sobering real-world data on the consequences of extended vacuum-like exposure comes not from space itself, but from a series of altitude chamber experiments conducted in the late 1950s and 1960s as part of the preparation for the early space programs. During this period, researchers at several aerospace medicine laboratories conducted experiments on animal subjects, primarily dogs and primates, to establish the physiological limits of vacuum exposure. These experiments were conducted with the explicit purpose of determining how long an unprotected biological system could survive in near-vacuum conditions, and what the nature and extent of the injuries would be at various exposure durations. The findings from these experiments are not pleasant reading, but they are scientifically important, and they fill in the section of the spectrum between 27 seconds and 3 minutes, with data that the human accidental exposure cases cannot provide. The consistent finding across multiple studies was that animal subjects exposed to near-vacuum conditions for periods of up to approximately 90 seconds, and then repressurized and given appropriate supportive care, survived. Not all of them, and not without injury, but the majority. The injuries documented in survivors included extensive subcutaneous emphysema, gas trapped under the skin, producing a characteristic crackling texture when the skin was pressed, pulmonary damage ranging from mild alveolar hemorrhage to more extensive barotrauma, cardiac arrhythmias that resolved over hours with oxygen therapy, neurological deficits that varied in severity and persistence depending on the exact duration of exposure. At exposure durations between 90 seconds and 2 minutes, survival rates in these studies dropped significantly. Subjects that survived this range required more intensive intervention, showed more extensive cardiac damage, and demonstrated more persistent neurological deficits. The quality of recovery, meaning the degree to which normal function was restored, declined sharply compared to the sub-90-second group. At exposures approaching and exceeding 3 minutes, survival was rare without immediate cardiac resuscitation following repressurization, and neurological recovery in those that survived was substantially incomplete. The 3-minute boundary that aerospace medicine has converged on as the edge of survivability is not a theoretical calculation. It is an empirically derived threshold supported by this animal data, by the physics of oxygen reserve depletion, by the mechanics of cardiac hypoxia, and by the handful of human cases that bracket it from the survivable end. Now, let us talk about what survival at the edge of that boundary actually looks like. Not the statistical survival rates from animal studies, the human experience of coming back from the threshold. The closest documented human analogue to near-complete vacuum exposure and recovery is not, technically, a vacuum exposure case at all. It is a category of medical emergency that emergency physicians encounter with some regularity, and that has been studied extensively precisely because its physiological consequences overlap so substantially with what we have been describing. That emergency is cardiac arrest, followed by successful resuscitation, particularly cardiac arrest in cases complicated by severe hypoxia before the arrest. Drowning victims, specifically those recovered from cold water, who have been submerged long enough to suffer cardiac arrest, but whose core body temperature has dropped sufficiently to suppress cellular metabolism and extend the window of cerebral resuscitability, are the population that most closely parallels the physiological situation of a vacuum exposure victim being repressurized at or just beyond the 3-minute mark. The mechanism of injury is different, the environmental context is completely different. But the core physiological insult is the same: prolonged total oxygen deprivation to the brain and heart, followed by restoration of circulation and the challenge of managing the consequences. What those consequences look like in the people who survive them has been studied in detail. The most consistent finding in survivors of prolonged cardiac arrest with anoxic brain injury is a phenomenon called post-hypoxic encephalopathy, a broad term for the neurological dysfunction that follows a period of insufficient oxygen delivery to the brain. It manifests differently depending on the duration and severity of the hypoxic episode, the individual's age and neurological reserve, the speed and quality of resuscitation, and the presence of other compounding injuries. In mild cases, post-hypoxic encephalopathy presents as a period of confusion and disorientation immediately following recovery of consciousness, lasting hours to a few days, followed by essentially complete neurological recovery. The person may not remember the event itself or the period immediately surrounding it. They may have difficulty with new memory formation for some time following the event, but their personality, their cognitive function, their ability to navigate their life remains intact. In moderate cases, the confusion and disorientation last longer, weeks rather than days, and some degree of lasting cognitive impairment becomes apparent as the acute phase resolves. Memory difficulties persist. Executive function, the capacity for planning, flexible thinking and impulse control is reduced. Processing speed slows. The person functions but differently than before. Some adaptation and recovery continues for months to years, as the brain's remarkable plasticity allows intact regions to partially compensate for the function of damaged ones. In severe cases, the person who regains consciousness is not, in any meaningful neurological sense, the same person who lost it. The damage to the hippocampus and other medial temporal lobe structures is permanent. The damage to the frontal lobe, to the association cortices that integrate information across brain regions and give human cognition its characteristic flexibility and depth, is extensive. The person may be ambulatory, they may be able to eat and communicate, but the inner life, the continuous narrative thread of a human consciousness moving through time, has been fundamentally altered or destroyed. This is the spectrum that a vacuum exposure victim repressurized at or near the 3-minute mark inhabits. Not certainly dead, but not certainly the same person who crossed the threshold. The physical body may be recoverable. The neurological person is a question mark that only time and intensive care can begin to answer. And here is where the story of vacuum exposure intersects with one of the deepest questions in the ethics of space medicine and long-duration spaceflight. Because the scenario we have been describing, an astronaut exposed to vacuum for close to 3 minutes and then recovered, is not only theoretically possible, it is a scenario that mission planners, flight surgeons, and spacecraft designers have had to think carefully about. The question of what resources a spacecraft needs to carry to manage this kind of emergency. What medical interventions are possible in the microgravity environment of a spacecraft, how quickly repressurization can be accomplished, and what equipment is needed for the immediate post-rescue care. All of these are questions that space agencies have grappled with. The answers are sobering. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation in microgravity is genuinely difficult. The compression force needed to achieve effective chest compressions requires the rescuer to brace against something, since pushing down on a patient in microgravity without a fixed surface beneath them simply pushes both the patient and the rescuer apart with equal and opposite force. Techniques for microgravity, CPR, have been developed and trained, but they are less effective than their ground-based equivalents and significantly more physically demanding for the rescuer. Defibrillation in a spacecraft environment carries its own complications. The electrical discharge must not arc across the spacecraft's electronic systems. The pads must achieve good contact in a microgravity environment, where the patient may be restrained imperfectly. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy, the primary treatment for the embolism component of vacuum exposure injury, requires a pressurized chamber capable of achieving 2 to 3 atmospheres of pressure. No spacecraft currently flying carries such equipment. Astronauts who suffer serious decompression-related injuries in space must either manage with the oxygen therapy and supportive care available on the vehicle and wait for return to Earth, or, if they can return quickly enough, access a hyperbaric facility on the ground. The time from incident to ground-based hyperbaric treatment, even in the most optimistic scenario involving an ISS crew and a rapid emergency undocking and deorbit, is measured in hours. The window for most effective hyperbaric treatment of decompression injuries is measured in minutes to a small number of hours. The gap between these two timelines is a known and uncomfortable feature of current human spaceflight. Among the incidents in the history of human spaceflight that have come closest to this scenario, one stands above the rest in terms of how close it came to the boundary we have been discussing, and how its outcome shaped the subsequent approach to spacewalk suit safety. In 1997, during a spacewalk from the Russian Mir space station, American astronaut Jerry Linenger and Russian cosmonaut Vasily Siblyev were preparing for an EVA when a fault in one of the suits was detected. The fault was identified before the suits were fully depressurized for the EVA, and the problem was addressed. No one was exposed to vacuum. This is not the incident. The incident that comes closest to our scenario occurred during a 2013 spacewalk from the ISS involving Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano. During the EVA, water began accumulating inside Parmitano's helmet. Not a small amount. Over the course of approximately 23 minutes from the time the water was first noticed to the time Parmitano was safely back inside the airlock, approximately 1.5 liters of water accumulated in his helmet. The water covered his eyes, his nose, and his mouth. He navigated back to the airlock essentially blind and partially unable to breathe, tethered to the station and following the safety guidelines he had trained for, in a situation that the water was not a vacuum but was, from a suffocation and disorientation standpoint, arguably comparable to a moderate hypoxic emergency in terms of its immediate threat to consciousness and life. Parmitano survived with no lasting injury, but the investigation that followed his EVA produced one of the most detailed analyses of how close a spacesuit malfunction had come to causing a fatality since the Apollo program. The incident was classified as a high-consequence near miss. Changes to EVA protocols and suit maintenance procedures followed directly. What the Parmitano incident illustrates, beyond its immediate drama, is the nature of the threat environment in which spacewalking astronauts operate. The suits are extraordinary pieces of engineering. They are designed and maintained with extraordinary care. And they still nearly killed someone with water, with something as benign and terrestrial as water, 15 years into continuous ISS operations. The gap between the spacesuit and the vacuum it stands between is exactly the thickness of that suit, nothing more. There is another dimension of vacuum exposure injury that the countdown has not yet fully addressed, and it requires attention, because it operates on a timeline that extends well beyond the 3 minutes of acute exposure. It is the damage to the eyes, the acute effects of vacuum on the ocular structures, the subconjunctival hemorrhage from capillary rupture, the potential for intraocular pressure changes driven by embolism in the ocular fluids, the protrusion of the eyeballs from their orbits in severe cases. These are the acute injuries, the ones that manifest in the first minute or two of exposure. But the eyes in the space environment are subject to a secondary threat that operates on a completely different time scale, and that has become one of the most significant concerns in long-duration spaceflight, even for fully suited, properly protected astronauts. This threat is not from vacuum directly. It is from the microgravity environment that goes along with being in space, and it has a name: Spaceflight-Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, or SANS. SANS was first formally described and named in the early 2000s after a pattern of visual changes in returning long-duration ISS crew members was recognized as being more prevalent, more consistent, and more concerning than had previously been appreciated. In microgravity, the redistribution of body fluids toward the head and upper body that occurs in the absence of gravity's downward pull causes a chronic, low-level increase in intracranial pressure. This elevated pressure is transmitted to the fluid around the optic nerves, causing the optic nerve sheath to distend and the optic nerve head to swell in a pattern called papilledema. Over the course of months in microgravity, this can cause permanent changes to the structure of the eye. Flattening of the posterior of the eyeball, folds in the choroidal and retinal layers, and in some cases, lasting changes to visual acuity and visual field. SANS is not caused by vacuum exposure. It is caused by the microgravity environment, but it illustrates a principle that runs through the entire story of vacuum exposure and its consequences. The human body's vulnerability in space is not limited to the acute crisis of sudden depressurization. Space degrades the human body through multiple mechanisms simultaneously, some acute and dramatic, some chronic and insidious, and the full picture of what space does to a human body includes both. The 3-minute countdown we have been following is the acute version of this story. SANS is the chronic version. Both are real, both are consequences of the same fundamental mismatch between the biology of Homo sapiens and the environment beyond the atmosphere. By this point in our journey through the countdown and its aftermath, a question has probably been forming that has not yet been directly addressed. It is the most human question this story raises, and it deserves a direct answer. What would you experience? Not what would happen to your body, but what would the first-person experience of this countdown feel like from the inside, in the moments before consciousness ended? The evidence assembled from the handful of accidental partial exposures, from the accounts of people who have survived severe decompression sickness events, from the descriptions of LeBlanc and the high-altitude pilots who experienced partial suit failures, is remarkably consistent. The first sensation is the cold, not the cold of a cold day or a cold room. The cold of moisture evaporating from every surface of your mouth and throat simultaneously, a deep, immediate, spreading numbness that begins on the tongue and races across every mucous membrane it can reach. It is distinctive enough that the people who have experienced it describe it immediately and specifically, without prompting, as the most unusual physical sensation they have ever felt. The second sensation is the pressure change in the ears, the same sensation you feel when a plane changes altitude rapidly, but instantaneous and total. A sudden full pressure in the ear canals that does not equalize because there is no pressure on the other side to equalize with. The third sensation, following the first two within a second or two, is the beginning of the swelling. Not pain, not yet, but a tightness, a fullness throughout the body, the sense of your own skin becoming tight over what is inside it, like a balloon being inflated from the inside. And then, within approximately 10 seconds, the visual field begins to narrow. Not dramatically, not like the closing iris that film uses to signal unconsciousness, more like a dimming, a reduction in the contrast and clarity of what you can see, beginning at the periphery. The world does not go dark. It goes grey and distant and soft. And then it goes. Not with pain, not with fear, at least not fear that has time to process and articulate itself. The hypoxia that is ending consciousness is also, by this point, significantly impairing the higher cognitive functions that produce articulate fear. What the last second or two of consciousness likely contains is something more primitive and more diffuse than fear. An overwhelming wrongness, a biological alarm with no specific content, the body's most fundamental signal that something has gone catastrophically outside the parameters of survival. And then the alarm stops, because there is no one left to hear it. The final part of this countdown will step back from the physiological granularity of the last 3 minutes and ask the larger questions. What does this countdown mean for the future of human spaceflight? What does it reveal about the nature of the universe we live in? What does it say about us, that we have gone to space anyway, that we continue to go, that we are planning to go further and stay longer, knowing exactly what the cost of failure is? And it will answer one final question that the entire preceding story has been building toward. A question about the boundary between the habitable and the uninhabitable, between the possible and the lethal, that turns out to be far more personal, far more immediate, and far more relevant to the future of our species than the 3-minute countdown of a single human body in vacuum might at first suggest. 3 minutes, 180 seconds. The smallest unit of time that matters at the largest scale of our ambitions. 3 minutes. We have spent the entirety of this journey inside those 180 seconds tracing the cascade of physiological events from the first vaporization of moisture on the tongue to the final arrhythmic flutter of a hypoxic heart. We have followed the body through its extraordinary, doomed attempt to survive an environment it was never designed to enter. We have examined the evidence, sparse and carefully gathered, from the handful of real human encounters with vacuum and near-vacuum conditions. We have looked at the aftermath, at what survival looks like when it occurs, at what is lost and what can be recovered, at the gap between the body that crossed the threshold and the person who might, under the best possible circumstances, come back through it. Now, it is time to step back, to pull the camera, as it were, from the close biological detail of ruptured capillaries and failing cardiac conduction systems and place this 3-minute countdown in its larger context. To ask what it means, not just medically, not just physiologically, but cosmically, historically, and in terms of what it reveals about the particular position that the human species occupies in this universe right now, at this specific and extraordinary moment in the story of life on Earth. Because 3 minutes in the vacuum of space is not just a medical fact. It is a philosophical statement. It is the universe's way of making its terms perfectly clear. Let us begin with the history, because the 3-minute countdown did not always matter in the way it matters now. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, the question of how long a person could survive without a spacesuit in the vacuum of space was as practically irrelevant as the question of how long a fish could survive in the Sahara. The vacuum of space was not a place humans went. It was not a place humans could conceive of going. It existed, if it existed at all in the human conceptual framework, as the darkness above the sky, a theological or mythological space rather than a physical one with measurable properties and definable dangers. The question became relevant with extraordinary speed. In 1957, Sputnik became the first human-made object to orbit Earth. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to leave the atmosphere and return. In 1965, Alexei Leonov became the first human to perform a spacewalk, floating outside his Voskhod 2 capsule for 12 minutes, with nothing but a flexible suit and a tether separating him from the environment we have spent this entire story describing. The 3-minute boundary, which was previously a theoretical number derived from oxygen physiology and pressure calculations, suddenly had a human context. Suddenly there were people going to places where it mattered, where the difference between a functioning suit and a failed one was measured in the precise physiological terms we have been examining, where the countdown was not a thought experiment, but a real risk embedded in every EVA, every docking maneuver, every moment of every mission. Leonov's first spacewalk almost ended in precisely the kind of catastrophic suit failure that would have made this countdown immediately relevant. His suit inflated in the vacuum to the point where he could not bend his hands enough to grasp the handrail he needed to pull himself back into the airlock. He resolved this by opening a valve on his suit and deliberately bleeding off enough pressure to regain mobility. A decision that brought his suit pressure down to a level that was barely above the threshold for ableism, and that required him to re-enter the airlock head first because he had lost too much time to attempt a feet-first approach. He succeeded, but he was very close to a situation where the countdown we have been following would have become his countdown. In the 60-plus years of human spaceflight since Leonov's walk, the thin membrane between astronaut and vacuum has been tested many times. The Parmitano incident, the suit leak discovered by Sunita Williams during an EVA in 2006, the multiple instances of partial pressure loss in suit components during ISS operations. Each of these was caught, managed, resolved before the threshold was crossed. But each of them was also a reminder that the threshold exists, that it is close, and that the machinery standing between the human body and the countdown is precisely as reliable as the engineering and maintenance that supports it, no more and no less. What does it mean that we go anyway? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine one, and it deserves a genuine answer, because the decision to send human beings into an environment where a single mechanical failure can initiate a 3-minute countdown to death is not a decision made casually or unconsciously. It is a decision made with full knowledge of the risks, made repeatedly, made by the people taking the risks themselves as much as by the institutions that organize the missions. Astronauts know the countdown. They know it better than most people who will ever hear this story. They have studied it in training. They have practiced the emergency procedures designed to interrupt it. They have thought carefully in the particular way that people who genuinely face mortal risk think carefully about what it means and whether it changes their decision to go, and they go. The question is why. Not why in the sense of what motivation, what institutional pressure, what professional ambition drives them. Those factors exist and are real, but underneath those factors, underneath the specific biographical circumstances of each individual astronaut, there is something more fundamental. Something that the 3-minute countdown, understood in its full context, actually illuminates rather than simply threatening. The human body can survive 3 minutes in the vacuum of space. That number sounds like a limitation, but consider it from a different angle. The vacuum of space, the dominant state of the universe by volume, the environment that comprises the vast majority of all the space that exists between the particles of matter scattered through 13 billion light-years of cosmic history, gives a human being 3 minutes. Not 3 seconds, not 3 milliseconds, 3 minutes, 180 seconds of survival, in an environment that the laws of physics did not in any way design for or accommodate life. That 3 minutes exists because of the extraordinary specific engineering of the human body, because of the diving reflex and the peripheral vasoconstriction and the hierarchical hypoxic tolerance of the nervous system. Because of the 4 billion years of relentless selection pressure that built a biological machine capable of surviving, briefly, conditions it was never selected for. 3 minutes is not how long the universe allows a human being to survive in vacuum. 3 minutes is how long the human body fights back against the universe's indifference. That distinction matters. Now, let us set the 3 minutes inside the cosmological timescale that gives this channel its reason for existing. Because the most important context for understanding what the 3-minute countdown means is not the history of spaceflight. It is the history of everything. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. In that 13.8 billion years, the conditions for life as we know it have existed for perhaps 10 billion years, since the first generation of stars processed hydrogen and helium into the heavier elements that carbon-based life requires, and since those elements were distributed through the galaxy by supernova explosions to eventually condense into rocky planets orbiting stable stars. Life on Earth has existed for approximately 3.8 billion of those years, beginning with single-celled prokaryotes in the primordial ocean and progressing through the full sweep of evolutionary history to the species listening to this story right now. Complex multicellular life has existed for roughly 600 million years. Animals with central nervous systems capable of something resembling experience have existed for perhaps 500 million years. Hominids, the lineage that eventually produced modern humans, have existed for approximately 6 million years. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens have existed for approximately 300,000 years. Spacefaring Homo sapiens, the particular variant of the species that has developed the technology to leave the atmosphere and survive in the environment described by this countdown, have existed for approximately 65 years. 65 years out of 13.8 billion. A fraction so small that expressing it as a percentage requires more decimal places than most calculators can display. The entire history of human spaceflight, from Sputnik to the International Space Station to every mission currently planned or in development, fits inside a sliver of cosmic time, so thin that it is essentially invisible against the full scale of the universe's history. And yet, here we are, standing at the threshold of a 3-minute window, looking out at a universe that has been running for 13.8 billion years without us, and beginning to enter it. The cosmic timeline of vacuum exposure does not end with the human body. It extends outward into the future, toward questions that the 3-minute countdown is the prologue of, rather than the conclusion. Because the history of spaceflight is not going backward. The trajectory is outward, from low Earth orbit to the Moon, from the Moon to Mars, from Mars to the outer solar system, from the outer solar system to the stars, from the stars to whatever the species might eventually become, across geological and cosmological timescales if it survives long enough to become anything at all. And each step outward increases the distance from the pressurized, life-supporting environments that interrupt the countdown. Each step outward makes the 3 minutes more important, not less. On the International Space Station, a vacuum exposure event is followed, in the best case, by repressurization within seconds and emergency medical care within minutes. The station is a pressurized refuge that is never more than a short spacewalk away. The countdown, if it begins, can theoretically be interrupted very quickly. On the surface of Mars, the situation is meaningfully different. Mars has an atmosphere, but it is an atmosphere of approximately 1% of Earth's sea level pressure, composed primarily of carbon dioxide. It is not vacuum in the strict technical sense, but it is close enough for the purposes of this countdown. The partial pressure of oxygen in the Martian atmosphere is essentially zero, and the total atmospheric pressure is insufficient to prevent ebulism. A suit failure on Mars initiates the same countdown we have been following, but the nearest pressurized refuge might be hundreds of meters or several kilometers away. The time to repressurization might be measured in minutes rather than seconds. The countdown, under those circumstances, becomes a much more pressing design parameter for everything from the suits to the habitats to the emergency response protocols of a Martian mission. On a spacecraft in deep space, between planets, the mathematics are even more demanding. A suit failure during an EVA in interplanetary space places the astronaut in an environment from which the nearest pressurized structure is whatever is at the end of the tether. The response time can be measured in seconds if everything goes right. But everything going right depends on a cascade of conditions, the other crew members immediately aware of the situation, the airlock functional and close, the casualty conscious enough or physically positioned such that retrieval is straightforward, none of which are guaranteed. The 3-minute countdown is not a historical artifact of the early space age. It is a design constraint that grows more significant with every kilometer we travel away from Earth. This brings us to one of the most significant questions in the current and near future development of human spaceflight. A question that the 3-minute countdown sits at the center of. What do we actually do about it? The engineering responses to the vulnerability described by this countdown have evolved substantially since Leonov's first spacewalk, but they fall into a relatively small number of categories: better suits, better procedures, better training, better emergency response capability. All of these are real and important, and all of them are being actively developed and improved. But there is a fourth category, one that has moved from the realm of science fiction into serious engineering and biomedical research over the past 2 decades. One that proposes not to make the environment safer or the suits more reliable, but to make the biological system more resilient. To change the 3-minute countdown itself, to extend it. This category is human biological augmentation for the space environment. The proposals range from the modest and near-term to the radical and speculative. At the modest end, pharmacological pre-treatment of astronauts before EVAs with agents that enhance the diving reflex, reduce metabolic rate, and increase hypoxic tolerance. Some research suggests that certain existing drugs, including agents that act on the adenosine receptor system and some mitochondrial uncouplers, can meaningfully extend the time of useful consciousness in hypoxic conditions. If the 9 to 12 second window of useful consciousness could be extended even to 30 seconds, the probability of a trained astronaut taking effective action to initiate self-rescue before incapacitation would increase substantially. At the more ambitious end, genetic modifications that express higher concentrations of myoglobin, the oxygen-storing protein in muscle tissue, throughout the body including the brain. Marine mammals like sperm whales and elephant seals carry several times the myoglobin concentration of humans in their muscles, and this is part of what enables their extraordinary breath-hold diving capacity. A human with marine mammal-level myoglobin concentrations would have substantially larger oxygen reserves in their tissues and correspondingly longer tolerance of hypoxic conditions. At the most speculative end, the possibility of suspended animation or metabolic suppression for emergency scenarios, placing a vacuum-exposed astronaut into a state of dramatically reduced metabolic demand immediately following repressurization to minimize the ongoing oxygen consumption of injured tissues while repair is underway. This idea, which draws on the observed phenomenon of patients surviving remarkably long cardiac arrests when they are hypothermic, is not yet clinically available. But the underlying biology is real and the research is active. None of these approaches changes the fundamental physics of the vacuum. None of them makes the universe more hospitable, but they represent the beginning of a serious, scientifically grounded conversation about whether the 3-minute countdown is fixed, or whether it is, like so many other apparent biological limits, a starting point for engineering rather than a final word. There is a philosophical dimension to this conversation that cannot be ignored, and that sits underneath every technological discussion about extending human tolerance for space. We are, at the moment, biological creatures attempting to exist in a physical environment that our biology is not suited for. This is not a new situation for our species. Homo sapiens has been colonizing environments outside the native tropical African range for at least 100,000 years, surviving in Arctic conditions, at high altitudes, in deserts, in conditions that required cultural and technological innovation to bridge the gap between what human biology could tolerate and what the environment demanded. The sleeping bag and the parka and the altitude acclimatization protocol are all, in a sense, the same kind of solution as the spacesuit, external technology that creates a buffer between the biological reality of what we are and the physical reality of where we want to be. The question that the long-term future of spaceflight raises is whether external technology is sufficient for the distances and durations that the ambition of the species is reaching toward. A Mars mission can probably be accomplished with external technology, with better suits and better habitats and better emergency protocols, and with the 3-minute countdown as an accepted but carefully managed risk. A mission to the outer solar system is harder. A mission to another star, even using the most optimistic propulsion technologies currently conceivable, would take decades to centuries even at a significant fraction of the speed of light, and would require the occupants to survive in the space environment in some form for a duration that makes any external technology solution deeply challenging. At some point, if the species is to become genuinely spacefaring in the sense of being capable of surviving and reproducing and building civilizations in environments other than the surface of this one planet, the question of whether we can continue to rely on external technology to bridge the biological gap, or whether the biology itself must change, becomes unavoidable. This is not a comfortable question. It engages deeply held intuitions about human identity, about what it means to be human, about the relationship between our biological nature and our sense of self. But it is a question that the 3-minute countdown makes concrete and personal in a way that more abstract discussions of human enhancement do not. Because the 3-minute countdown is not about enhancement in the sense of becoming stronger or smarter or longer lived. It is about survival, about whether the species that has begun to leave its home planet will have the biological capacity to survive the leaving, or whether it will always be dependent on an ever more sophisticated layer of technology standing between it and the indifferent vacuum. The universe does not have an opinion about this question. The vacuum does not care whether the 3-minute countdown ends in death or rescue, or eventual transcendence into a biology capable of surviving it indefinitely. The laws of physics that produce the countdown, Boyle's law, the oxygen dissociation curve, the hypoxic sensitivity of the cerebral cortex, are as old as the universe and as indifferent as its deep cold. But the universe's indifference is itself, in a strange way, a kind of freedom. The universe did not design the 3-minute countdown to kill us. It did not design it at all. It simply is what it is, the consequence of the specific physical and biological parameters that happen to describe both the vacuum of space and the living human body. There is no malice in it. There is no intent. There is only physics meeting biology at the edge of the atmosphere and producing a number, 180 seconds, and what we do with that number is entirely up to us. The species that developed the diving reflex to survive drowning, that developed fire to survive the cold, that developed agriculture to survive drought, that developed antibiotics to survive infection, that developed, in a geological eye blink of 65 years, the technology to leave the planet entirely. This species has a particular relationship with physical limits that is worth noting. It does not accept them as final. It studies them, characterizes them, understands them in precise detail, and then begins, systematically and creatively, to push against them. The 3-minute countdown has been characterized, it has been studied in animal subjects and accidental human exposures. It has been modeled computationally and validated against the cases we have examined in this story. The number is known, the mechanisms are understood, the geography of the injury is mapped. The difference between survivable and not, between recoverable and not, between the person who went in and the person who might come back, is as well understood as the research base allows. What happens next is not physiology. It is choice. Before we bring this countdown to its close, there is one final thing worth understanding about the 3-minute window, something that the physiological detail of the earlier parts of this story prepares you to appreciate in a way that you could not have appreciated at the beginning. The 3-minute countdown, in the most precise scientific sense, does not have a single endpoint. We have discussed clinical death and biological death and the gradient of neurological recovery potential as the countdown progresses. But what we have not yet explicitly named is the thing that the 3-minute window is actually measuring. Not the time until death, exactly. Something more specific and more interesting than that. It is measuring the resilience of a particular kind of organization. Your body is not fundamentally different from the universe around it in terms of the matter it contains. The atoms in your body, the carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and the trace elements that make up the rest, are the same atoms that are scattered through the interstellar medium, forged in stellar cores and distributed by supernovae across the galaxy. You are made of the same stuff as the vacuum that surrounds you. The difference is not material. The difference is organizational. The difference is the specific, extraordinarily improbable arrangement of those atoms into the structures that perform the functions of life. The 3-minute countdown is the time it takes for that organization to dissolve in the absence of the conditions that maintain it. It is a measure of the fragility of the arrangement, yes. But it is also, if you look at it from the other direction, a measure of its persistence. The fact that it takes 180 seconds for the vacuum to undo what 4 billion years of evolution built is not a testament to frailty. It is a testament to how robust, how deeply redundant, how extraordinarily engineered by selection pressure that biological organization actually is. 3 minutes is a long time. In the right frame of reference, 3 minutes is long enough for another person to reach you, long enough for an airlock to cycle, long enough for a spacecraft to repressurize, long enough, in the right circumstances with the right preparation and the right equipment and the right proximity to a pressurized refuge, for the cascade to be interrupted and the organization to be restored. The universe gives you 3 minutes, not as a sentence, but as a window. What matters, what has always mattered, is what we build on the other side of the glass. We began this story at the beginning, the number 180, the outer edge of human survivability in the vacuum of space without protection. A number measured in seconds, carrying inside it the entire weight of what we are as biological beings and what we are attempting to become as a spacefaring species. We traced the countdown second by second from the first cold sensation of vaporizing moisture on the tongue to the final arrhythmic failure of a hypoxic heart. We watched the body fight, with every tool that 4 billion years of evolution gave it, against an environment that those 4 billion years never anticipated. We examined the aftermath, the slim evidence from real human encounters with vacuum and near-vacuum conditions, the animal studies that fill in the darker parts of the spectrum, the space medicine research that is quietly, carefully, building a response to a risk that grows more relevant with every kilometer we travel from Earth. And we stepped back, finally, to ask what it all means, what it says about us that we go anyway, what it reveals about the universe that the dominant state of its volume is incompatible with the most complex arrangement of matter we have ever found within it, what it portends for a species that is only 65 years into the project of leaving its home planet and that has already begun asking whether the biology that limits it to 3 minutes might eventually be something other than a final answer. The vacuum of space is the universe's default state. Warmth and pressure and the chemical richness that life requires are the exception, not the rule. A thin skin on a small rocky planet orbiting an ordinary star, precious exactly because of how rare it is, how specifically calibrated to the particular chemistry of this particular biology, how easily disrupted. The 3-minute countdown is what happens when that exception meets the rule. When the skin is broken, when the equilibrium that you have never once thought about, the balance of pressure inside and outside, the invisible cradle that holds the organization of your life together, gives way to the vast, cold, pressureless majority of everything. 180 seconds. The universe is patient. It has been running for 13.8 billion years and will run for trillions more, long past the last star and the last black hole and the last organized structure of any kind. It does not hurry, it does not press, it simply waits as it has always waited, as it will always wait, for the conditions that sustain the thin exceptions of warmth and life and consciousness to fail. And when they fail, it takes 3 minutes, not a second more, not a second less, 3 minutes. And then the organization dissolves back into the rule, back into the vast, indifferent, beautiful, terrifying default, back into the silence that preceded us and will outlast us by an interval so large it has no name in any language any human being has ever spoken. 3 minutes is what we have. The question, the only question that matters in the long run of this species and its ambitions, is what we do with it.